Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and I'm going to tell you about Frank Birk. And Frank was one of the ones from the whole thing, from the right stuff, and they were called test pilots, and no one knew their name. I think Frank is an individual that only a few of us know his name, but he's a very remarkable individual, both personally and professionally. And I'm going to tell you some stories about Frank Birk that I think you'll find interesting. And I know you've never heard them before because they're just stories between Frank and I've never mentioned them to anybody that I remember. So I'm going to tell you some stories that I think you might find interesting about Frank, and to talk about what an interesting guy he was. And like a lot of the guys on the B-1 program, in that B-1, B-2, a lot of people don't know their names. They did some remarkable work for some aircraft that are very important in the inventory of Air Force aircraft, and they just kind of drift away. And but I want to tell you about Frank. Now, one thing at Edwards is you do not want to get a street named after you, because street, building, things like that, complex, you basically have to die. And see that Rogers Avenue there with the yellow arrow? Okay, Grissom, we all know Grissom. Grissom, Chaffee, and White in Apollo 1. We all know that story. Test pilots who died, astronauts. But the Rogers, that must have been a different Rogers. That wasn't me. In fact, this housing area and none of the housing areas when I was out there back in '79 still exist. So this was new. And it would have been fun if I was out there at the time, if I could have, to live on the street with my name. But I digress. Okay, let me talk about something that really got my attention here. Now, what got my attention is they came out with this paper, the most recent Society of Experimental Test Pilots Symposium, and it's titled "Everyone Who Knows That Is Dead." And what it is involved in is the fact that the B-1 has three weapon bays, a forward, mid, and aft, and that's where most of the weapons are held. But it also had the capability for external storage. And they wanted to get some information about this. And I'm really surprised that the documentation doesn't exist. But I started about external storage, and I started to think about it. I go, well, yeah, all the leaders are gone. All the people who were primary involved in this are dead. And I was a very young chase pilot, and I'm probably one of the few people who actually chased the initial B-1A models before they were made the B models, which weren't quite as fast, and other factors. But I'm one of the few people, maybe still even alive, who ever chased it. Now, I don't know any. I never chased external weapon separation. I chased internal weapon separation and SRAM launches and firing off flares and high speed flight and stuff like that. But I never did the external store separation. So yeah, that does qualify that I am not familiar with this, even though I did chase the early model A models. So here is the mid Bay Area internal carriage. And this is, like I said, this is where the weapons were carried that I chased, and not any that were on external hard points on the wing outside of this carriage. So, like I mentioned, Frank became in charge of the B-1 program after I had left Edwards, and was in charge of that program, and later the B-2 program. And these are amazing programs. Now, when I went out in Edwards initially in '77, I was assigned to the O2. Now, my thing was I didn't get in the Air Force to fly an airplane this slow. Now, airplanes I were used to having two throttles, two engines, two throttles. This thing had six throttles. I have no idea what those balloons are about. This thing had six throttles, and it went slower than the T-38 in the traffic pattern because you had throttles, you had props, and you had mixtures. And I deal with that now on my, Cessna, but that's a whole different thing. But I'm assigned to this, and I'm in test operations, and that's where they throw all the pilots, the guys brand new out of the test pilot school, and other guys who are assigned flying positions. And so I'm not a test pilot. I didn't go through test pilot school. Frank went through test pilot school, and he's a newly minted test pilot. In fact, Frank was an academy graduated. He graduated the academy in 1968. I graduated high school in 1968, so I'm a little bit behind. Okay, well, I had the privilege of doing the same job that the test pilots were doing. I was chasing. And a number of the test pilots resented the fact that I hadn't gone through test pilot school and I was getting to do the same mission they were. And, it showed. By some people, was not treated very well. But Frank treated me very, very well. And I didn't know as much about Frank at the time as I later would learn, but it was quite interesting. And Frank and I flew a number of missions together in the O2. And one of them, we flew into Alameda Naval Air Station, back when it actually was an operational base, a Navy base. And it was kind of interesting. We were sitting on the runway looking at that bridge going, if we lose an engine, do we go over it or under it? And we're thinking maybe because of the weak power on the O2, it's the Cessna 337, and they load it full of crap, extra weight. So most of these light twins don't perform well. This made it even worse. You lose an engine, and you were in a world of hurt. But we were going into Alameda, which was the closest base to get to San Francisco, because Frank had this thing where he liked to buy paintings from this artist who was up in Marin County, I think it was, up north of San Francisco there. So he would rent a car, and we'd go up there, and he'd get these paintings, and then we'd bring them back in the O2. We did cross-country flights like this for proficiency, so hey, why not, where do you want to go? So let's go here and do this. So it was kind of interesting. We go in there, and we're both in our orange flight suits, and we're going to have supper. So we go to the Navy Officers Club, and the guy in charge of it looks at us and says, "You can't come in here in flight suits." And I go, "Well, we could in the Air Force. We didn't know any better." But they would not let us into the O Club. So we said, well, what the heck? We went back to the barracks. We changed out of the flight suits. Because, in the Air Force, you wear a flight suit into the O Club because you got this pocket where you put the lighter fluid. So when you're talking to other pilots about flying, you can set this hand on fire because you're shooting at it, So that's a fighter pilot story. But anyway, the whole thing was they weren't going to let us in, so we got in civilian clothes, rented a car, and we went over and we actually ate at the Rusty Scupper, I think, somewhere in San Francisco, a restaurant there, and we had a good time. We came back, and Frank was driving, we didn't have that many drinks, but he's driving this car, and I think it was a Datsun or something like that, and it's got these really cheap hubcaps, and Frank gets a little too far over and dings the front the hubcaps against the kind of sidewalk. We were going through a tunnel there, and he kind of dinged those up, and go, oh great, now we're going to have to pay a damage deposit. Well, we get back there, we tell the kid, we dinged up the hubcaps, and he looks at that and he says, most people don't even tell us, forget about it. So okay, we got off the hook there. But Frank and I flew the O2 on quite a few missions, and on one of the trips to San Francisco, and in the O2, it's a long trip from Edwards. This is not a fast aircraft, and we had these 30 millimeter shell casings that they had made into ashtrays. Yes, people smoked in the O2 while we were flying. In fact, when I got my checkout from the colonel in the O2, he's sitting there in the right seat with a cigarette in his hand, smoking, flicking it into the ashtray, which was his 30 millimeter shell. Well, Frank had to relieve himself. His bladder was getting full, and decided that, well, he needed to do something about it. So he ended up peeing into this cartridge. and got it full. And it's kind of like, well, what are we going to do with that? And he says, well, I'll just toss it out. I'll just open the window and dump it. Well, this was on a trip coming back from San Francisco, coming to Edwards, and he opens the window, and I would say half of the urine went outside of the aircraft. The other half was inside the aircraft, and it made a big streak down the side window. And it was like, oh gosh. And Frank was quite embarrassed. And we land there, and the crew chief comes up. We land back at Edwards, and the crew chief comes up and goes, what's with this? And Frank says, I just need a bucket and a cloth, and I'll take care of it. So Frank took care of the little stain. Now, another time, we were up flying the O2, and Edwards gets hot. Okay, I don't think I'm giving away any secrets there. Edwards can get very hot, and we were flying in the O2, being a single engine aircraft, all single engine prop aircraft. Well, any aircraft has a maximum single engine altitude. This is the maximum altitude it can actually hold if it's down to single engine, because above that, for loss of air density due to the air temperature and altitude and stuff like that, you can't maintain level flight. So there's a maximum single engine service ceiling. And the day we were flying, the service ceiling was below ground level at Edwards. So, okay, that's fine. Well, if we lose an engine, we can't really maintain altitude. Well, we had been down chasing coyotes over the desert. We were trying to interact with nature and stuff like that. So we were playing with a few coyotes and decided, hey, let's go up to the north there, up to Bishop, where they have a ski area up there. And let's go up there and just for fun fly up there. We're just trying to get flight time, maintaining proficiency and stuff like that. So we head on up, we climb on up, and it's my turn to do the flying. We traded that off, and I'm sitting there and I'm having a little trouble sinking the engines, getting the props to sink. Wah, 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 wah. Anybody who's flown multi-engine aircraft, prop aircraft, even the jets do that a little bit. You're sitting there. So I'm sitting there and I'm trying to adjust the prop levers, and I'm in the left seat, and I'm looking across my knuckles, and right across the top of my knuckles are the engine instrument cluster. And I happen to notice that the left engine, the oil pressure has just gone to 0. And I go, well, that's interesting. And all of a sudden, boom, it feathers. The rear engine feathers. Now, anybody who's flown the 337 knows that's a critical engine, because most of the time you don't know it's failed. Well, it was at high powered, and it was obvious that it had failed. But Frank was a little worried that it may not have fully feathered, so he wanted to check it out. And we had these. We didn't wear helmets in that aircraft. We wore these little headsets, the old military type, really crappy headset. So Frank opens the window, looks out, and he comes back, and he's just got this big grin on his face. And I go, what are you smiling about? And he goes, well, first of all, it's feathered. Secondly, the headset's gone. He says, yeah, one of those coyotes probably has a headset down there. So, okay, fine. Well, okay, we've lost an engine. It's feathered. We're on the front engine, and we're at about 4,000 feet. Single engine altitude is below ground level, so it's like, we better head on back to Edwards, which was the nearest place to land. And the neat thing about it, see, this is the neat thing about Frank. Frank was a much more experienced pilot. Frank had been through 2 tours of Vietnam and more than 800 combat missions. I mean, this guy already, we're both test ops pilots, and this is before he did any of the great stuff he did. But he didn't say, well, I'm the test pilot, I'm much more experienced, I'm going to take the aircraft. No, he let me fly it, even though it was rather a critical situation. So that's pretty amazing. And I flew directly back to Edwards. I declared an emergency and said, I need direct to the runway. And we were landing on 22. Where we were northeast of there, I had to go by. And I'm running out of altitude at full power the whole way. The only time I pulled the power back was in the flare. So I'm at full power, and I'm doing this 180-degree turn to final, the typical turns we do, tied in. And in the turn, I drop the gear. And as I come back around, I start getting a little bit of flaps out. I mean, I got a 15,000-foot runway with a big underrun there, too. It might have been better to go to one of the lake bed runways. It might have been a titch closer, but we thought we could make it. So did the turn, put it down, landed, and taxied single engine back. So that was kind of neat. Frank didn't say, hey, I'm the superior guy, I'm going to take it. He let me fly the airplane. Well, Frank ends up going to the T-38, and I also go to the T-38. Now, an interesting thing, and a lot of people know this story. Frank was chasing an A-10 gun mission that Rusty Gideon was flying, and they had a little issue where they got the wrong bullets in there, and they had this issue where this is normal where the A-10 fires and you get just the cloud of smoke in front of it, but they were having an issue with the propellant not fully burning correctly, and you ended up with this big fireball out in front of the airplane. Well, that fireball went back and it flamed out both engines. And he's at a low altitude doing gunnery firing out in one of the restricted areas, and both engines are gone. He sees the turbine inlet temperature on both of them just go right through red line, and the engines are gone. And it's like, well, even if he had the APU running at the time, later they had a procedure where during the gunfiring, you would run the APU in case you lost the engine so you could quickly try to start them. He would have had to start the APU, and he said, I didn't even know if those engines, he felt they were probably trash. So he ends up ejecting. Frank is the chase pilot, and he's getting these pictures at 200 frames a second. And I went and later I saw, I was talking to Rusty Gideon, and he showed me the video, and it's absolutely amazing. Not only the ejection, but when the airplane actually went in and it started digging a trough on the ground with the left wingtip, and then it kind of comes over, and the nose hits and the whole thing crunches. And I mean, it's all in slow motion. It was the most amazing video I'd ever seen before and since of a crash. And I thought for sure somebody would use it in a made-for-TV movie or something, but I never saw it reappear. It was just a one-time event, and should have gotten out because it's really cool footage. Well, then I later became a senior flight examiner in the T-38, and I gave Frank a check ride before I was, on my way out to go fly for the airlines. And we had a lot of interesting flights together. One of them was we're flying night patterns. We didn't get much nighttime in test flying, because unless it was a mission that needed the night situation for some reason, there wasn't a lot of test flying. So we're out there and we're flying patterns on runway 22, and you're over the lake bed and there are no lights. And we were commenting to each other, this is a really interesting experience because you had very poor references, but that's one of the things I remember flying with Frank. But here's the deal. That south complex there used to call South Base is now the Burke flight test area there. Frank was a very interesting individual, like I said. His last endeavor was on the B-2, and he was in charge of the B-1 program, and very, very well liked, very intense individual, very dedicated to the mission and his family. And most of the people that I saw, I would see a lot of people beginning out, and some of them I'd go, yeah, he's not going to go anywhere. Other ones I go, this guy's going to go somewhere. Frank was one of those guys that I knew that he was going to go somewhere. And let me tell you about the last time I ever saw Frank. Frank, I saw him actually in the waiting area. I'm coming down to get on the flight. I was a 727 second officer, very new at the airline, and I'm coming down and I see Frank sitting in the boarding area. So I go up to him and I say, "Hi, Frank, how you doing?" I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "I'm going down to Tyndall Air Force Base to be checked out in the F-16 to be a chase pilot." And I talked to the, I was just a lowly second officer, but I talked to the lead flight attendant, and I said, I noticed we had a couple of first class seats. Yes, this is back pre-mileage plus and all that, and we actually you could have empty first class seats. Amazing. Can you believe that? And I said, can we move Frank up? And she was able to do that. And it was kind of an interesting flight. I digress here, but we had a lower aft body overheat, which means that we had a hot air duct that was overheating. I got a yellow caution light, and you go through this procedure. Now, unlike the modern airplanes, the modern airplanes will go through shutting all these valves and stuff and trying to isolate it, but at the time you had to manually do it, and I had to, we were losing a certain bit of our bleed air, so pressurization was going to become an issue, and we had to prematurely descent, and I kind of told Frank about it. I said, other than the crew, you're the only one who, the only passenger who knows about this, and I told him about the little incident, and he thought this kind of funny. But anyway, he goes down, gets checked out in the F-16, and that was the last time I actually had an opportunity to see Frank. Now, Frank retired on April 29th, 1993. That was when he did his final flight in the B-2. And after retiring, he joined 2 days after retiring from the Air Force, he joined Rockwell International, and he joined a program testing a prototype jet trainer underdeveloped for the Air Force and the Navy. Now, he was doing a high-speed, low-altitude test flight north of Munich, Germany, and there was a mechanical problem with the aircraft. And I remember hearing that there was some malfunction of the speed brake or something, and the aircraft went out of control. And Frank did not have a successful ejection. He survived for a good number of days, but he eventually succumbed to his injuries. And you notice that chest full of medals there. I'm going to speak about that in just a second. Now, it was a funny thing because, of course, we're in flight suits, and you don't wear medals in your flight suits. And Frank was just a nice guy to me, normal guy to me. I did not realize what this guy had accomplished in his career up to this time, which was quite amazing. But Frank ended up being buried at the Academy. He had a flyover of 2 B-1s, and Frank was very dedicated to the Air Force Academy. And his career included flying 65 different aircraft, 2 tours of Vietnam, and more than 800 combat missions. He earned 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 Silver Stars, 27 Air Medals, the Purple Heart. He was also awarded the Laotian Order of Elephants from the King of Laos, the country's highest honor, which only 2 other Americans had been awarded. And, when I was working with Frank, flying with Frank, he never told me about this. Frank was just a very modest guy, very determined, intense, dedicated to the program. He really was. And just an amazing guy. And unfortunately for him, he died just a very short time after retiring from the Air Force. He had a very distinguished career. He should have had a very nice retirement, as a lot of them do. They get out of the Air Force, they go into civilian test pilot jobs, and they have a very nice career. Unfortunately for Frank, it ended early. But anyway, that's my stories about Frank. I hope you found them interesting and enjoyable, and I know a number of them you have never heard before. So that is my contribution to the memory of, at the time I knew him, Captain Frank Birk. Anyway, a super guy. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable, and thanks for watching.